Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell stood at the edge of the training mat, watching the younger Marines go through their combat drills. At 42, she was one of the few women in the Special Operations Training Program at Camp Pendleton, California. Her salt and pepper hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her lean frame showed years of discipline and dedication. She had spent 20 years in the Navy, the last 8 as a SEAL. Sarah had earned every stripe on her uniform through blood, sweat, and countless hours of proving herself in a world that didn't always want her there. She had served in Iraq, Afghanistan, and on classified missions she could never talk about. But here, in this gym, some people only saw a middle-aged woman who didn't belong. "All right, everyone pair up for sparring drills," called out Sergeant Marcus Webb, the head instructor. He was a mountain of a man, 30 years old, with arms like tree trunks and an ego to match. Sarah moved toward the mat, but Webb held up his hand. "Mitchell, you sit this one out. We're doing advanced takedowns today. Don't want anyone getting hurt." The comment stung, but Sarah kept her face neutral. "Sir, I'm certified in advanced combat. I can handle it." Webb smirked. "I'm sure you were something back in the day, ma'am, but these kids are at their peak. Why don't you observe and maybe learn something new?" A few of the younger Marines snickered. Sarah felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she nodded and stepped back. This wasn't the first time she'd been dismissed, and it probably wouldn't be the last. She had learned to pick her battles. As she watched from the sidelines, Sarah noticed 2 recruits in particular, Jackson Reed and Tyler Moss. They were both in their mid-20s, cocky and aggressive. Reed was the type who talked constantly about his high school football glory days. Moss was quieter but had a mean streak that showed in how rough he was with his sparring partners. "Hey, Mitchell," Reed called out during a water break. "You ever actually see combat, or did they just keep you behind a desk?" Several heads turned. Sarah met his gaze calmly. "I've seen my share, Reed." "Right," he laughed. "Bet you typed up a lot of reports, real dangerous stuff." Tyler Moss joined in. "My cousin said they lowered all the standards when they let women into the SEALs. That true, ma'am?" Sarah took a slow breath. She had heard versions of this conversation 100 times. The standards weren't lowered for anyone. Every SEAL, male or female, earns their trident the same way. "Sure," Reed said with a smirk. "Whatever helps you sleep at night." Sergeant Webb overheard but said nothing. He just turned away, as if the conversation wasn't happening. Sarah felt the familiar weight of isolation settle on her shoulders. Even after everything she had accomplished, she was still fighting for basic respect. That evening, Sarah sat in her small quarters on base, looking at a photograph on her desk. It showed her and her team from 6 years ago, standing in front of a helicopter in some dusty corner of the world. 3 of those men were gone now. She had carried one of them, wounded, for 2 miles through enemy territory. She had saved his life that day, though he died 2 years later in another operation. She touched the frame gently. They had respected her. They had trusted her with their lives, and she had earned that trust every single day. But here, starting over at a new base, she was nobody again, just another woman who didn't belong. The next morning, Sergeant Webb announced a new training schedule. "We're doing full contact sparring all week. This is where we separate those who can handle the pressure from those who can't." His eyes flicked to Sarah when he said it. She knew what he was doing. He wanted her to quit, to remove herself so he didn't have to deal with the complication of having a woman in his advanced class. But Sarah Mitchell didn't quit. She never had, and she wasn't about to start now. She just didn't know that by the end of the week, everything would change, and the 2 men who mocked her would learn a lesson they would never forget. The sparring sessions grew more intense as the week progressed. Sergeant Webb pushed everyone hard, but Sarah noticed he pushed her harder. Her breaks were shorter. Her rounds were longer. When she performed a technique perfectly, he barely acknowledged it. When she made the smallest mistake, he made sure everyone heard about it. "Mitchell, you're telegraphing that right hook from a mile away," he'd shout. In a real fight, you'd be dead already. Sarah absorbed the criticism and adjusted. She had been through worse than verbal jabs, but she could feel the atmosphere in the gym shifting. The more Webb dismissed her, the more the younger recruits felt empowered to do the same. On Wednesday afternoon, Webb announced a change. Today we're doing submission sparring, chokes, joint locks, the works. This is where technique matters more than size. He paused, looking directly at Sarah. Mitchell, you're up first. Reed, you're with her. Jackson Reed grinned as he stepped onto the mat. He had at least 60 pounds on Sarah and 5 inches in height. He cracked his knuckles dramatically. Don't worry, ma'am, he said loud enough for everyone to hear. I'll try to be gentle. Sarah ignored the comment and took her position. When Webb blew the whistle, Reed came at her aggressively, trying to use his size advantage. But Sarah had been doing this for 2 decades. She slipped his first attempt, redirected his momentum, and within 30 seconds had him in an arm lock. Tap out, Reed, she said calmly. He tapped, his face red with embarrassment. As they reset, she could see the anger in his eyes. Pride was a dangerous thing in young men. The second round started the same way, but this time Reed was more cautious. They grappled for position, neither gaining a clear advantage. Sarah was working for a leg lock when Reed suddenly changed tactics. Instead of going for a clean submission, he grabbed her in a sloppy headlock and started squeezing, hard. This wasn't technique. This was brute force, fueled by wounded ego. Sarah tapped his arm, the signal to release, but Reed held on. She tapped again, harder. Still nothing. Her vision started to blur at the edges. She could hear the blood pounding in her ears. Reed, she's tapping, someone shouted. Finally, Sergeant Webb stepped in. Reed let go. Reed released her and stepped back, breathing hard. Sarah dropped to one knee, gasping for air. Her throat felt crushed and the room spun around her. You okay, Mitchell? Webb asked, but his tone suggested he was more annoyed than concerned. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice yet. She stood up slowly, her hand at her throat. Maybe you should sit out the rest of the day, Webb suggested. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order disguised as concern. But Sarah shook her head. I'm fine, sir. You sure about that? Reed asked with a smirk. You look a little shaken up. Maybe this is too much for you. Their eyes met, and Sarah saw it clearly. He had done it on purpose. The choke had been retaliation for her beating him, and he knew Webb wouldn't do anything about it. I said I'm fine, Sarah repeated, her voice hoarse but steady. All right then, Webb said. Moss, you're up next with Mitchell. Tyler Moss stepped onto the mat with a cold smile. Sarah's throat still ached, and she could feel the bruising starting, but she took her position anyway. This round was worse. Moss fought dirty from the start, elbows in places they shouldn't be, pressure on her injured throat during grappling exchanges. And then, in what should have been a simple guard pass, he shifted his weight directly onto her neck and squeezed. Sarah tapped immediately, but just like Reed, Moss held on for several seconds longer than he should have. When he finally released her, Sarah rolled to her side, coughing and struggling to breathe. Moss, what the hell? One of the other Marines said. Sorry, ma'am, Moss said, not sounding sorry at all. Didn't see you tap. It all happened so fast, you know. Sarah got to her feet, her legs unsteady. She looked at Sergeant Webb, waiting for him to address what had just happened, but Webb just checked his watch. All right, that's enough for today. Hit the showers, everyone. No consequences, no correction, nothing. As the room cleared out, Sarah stood alone on the mat, her hand at her bruised throat. She had faced enemy combatants, survived explosions, and completed missions that would break most people. But this deliberate disrespect, this targeted humiliation, cut deeper than she expected. She walked slowly to the locker room, each breath painful. In the mirror, she could already see the bruises forming on her neck, dark purple marks that would take weeks to fade. Sarah had always believed in the system, in the chain of command. in doing things the right way. But as she stared at her reflection, she realized that sometimes the system protected the wrong people. She just didn't know yet that someone had been watching, someone who would make sure this didn't go unanswered. The next morning, Sarah woke with her throat so swollen she could barely swallow. The bruises had darkened overnight, forming an ugly necklace of purple and black around her neck. She stood in front of the mirror, gently touching the tender skin. She should report this. What Reed and Moss had done went beyond rough sparring, it was assault. But Sarah had been in the military long enough to know how these things went. She would file a complaint, there would be an investigation, and in the end, it would be her word against theirs. Reed and Moss would say it was an accident. Sergeant Webb would back them up, and Sarah would be labeled as someone who couldn't handle the training. She had seen it happen to other women. Once you got that reputation, your career was over. So Sarah did what she had always done. She put on her uniform, held her head high, and reported for duty. At breakfast in the mess hall, she noticed the stares. The bruises were impossible to hide. Some people looked at her with sympathy, others with barely concealed satisfaction. Reed and Moss sat at a corner table, laughing about something. Sarah got her coffee and sat alone, as she usually did. "Mind if I join you?" She looked up to see Commander David Walsh standing with his tray. He was in his late 50s, with gray hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades in special operations. Sarah knew of him. Everyone did. Walsh was a legend, one of the original Navy SEALs who had served in conflicts going back to the First Gulf War. He was at Camp Pendleton as a senior advisor, helping to shape the next generation of training protocols. "Of course, sir," Sarah said, surprised. Walsh sat down and studied her face for a moment, his eyes lingering on her bruised throat. "Those look painful." "Training accidents, sir," Sarah said automatically. "Is that right?" Walsh took a sip of his coffee. "Funny thing about training accidents, they usually happen to people who don't know what they're doing. You've been doing this for what, 20 years? 18 as a SEAL, sir." "Right, so not likely to be an accident on your end." He set down his cup. "I was observing the training session yesterday. Came in through the back entrance, so most people didn't notice me, but I noticed quite a bit." Sarah's heart started beating faster. "Sir, I saw Reed hold that choke well past your tap. I saw Moss do the same thing, and I saw Sergeant Webb do absolutely nothing about it." Walsh's voice was calm, but there was steel underneath. "What I'm trying to figure out is why you haven't filed a report." Sarah looked down at her tray. "With respect, sir, I'm not sure it would do any good." "Because you think no one would believe you, or because you've seen how the system treats women who speak up?" The directness of the question caught Sarah off guard. She met his eyes and saw genuine concern there, not judgment. "Both, sir," she admitted quietly. Walsh nodded slowly. "I understand that. I've seen good people pushed out because they reported legitimate problems. The military has made progress, but we still have a long way to go." He leaned forward. "But here's the thing, Lieutenant Commander Mitchell. Those two boys assaulted you. Not because they're better fighters, you were handling them just fine. They did it because they wanted to put you in your place. And Webb let it happen because he doesn't think you belong here." Hearing someone else say it out loud made Sarah's throat tighten. She blinked back unexpected tears. "I looked into your record," Walsh continued. "Silver Star for valor in Afghanistan, 2 Bronze Stars. You pulled a wounded operator out of a hot zone while under fire. You've completed more high-risk operations than Reed and Moss combined will ever see." He paused. "You've earned your place here 100 times over, but you shouldn't have to keep proving it." "What would you suggest I do, sir?" Sarah asked. Walsh smiled slightly. "Well, you have 2 options. Option 1, you file a formal complaint. I'll back you up as a witness. We go through official channels. It'll be messy and it'll take time, but we'd make sure it's handled properly." "And Option 2?" "Option 2 is a bit more educational." Walsh's smile widened. Tomorrow is the monthly open sparring session. Any personnel on base can participate, regardless of rank. It's meant to build camaraderie and share skills across different units. He looked at her meaningfully. I'm planning to attend, and I think Reed and Moss could benefit from some additional training. Sarah understood what he was suggesting. Sir, I appreciate the offer, but I can fight my own battles. I know you can. You've proven that over and over. Walsh stood up with his tray. But sometimes it's not about proving you can fight. It's about making sure the lesson sticks. Those boys need to learn that actions have consequences, and Sergeant Webb needs to learn that his negligence doesn't go unnoticed. He started to walk away, then turned back. Think about it, Mitchell. Sometimes the system works, sometimes it doesn't, but there's always more than one way to get justice. As Sarah watched him leave, she felt something shift inside her. For the first time since arriving at Camp Pendleton, she didn't feel quite so alone. That evening, she made her decision. She would attend the open sparring session, and she would watch as Commander Walsh taught Reed and Moss a lesson they desperately needed to learn. Part 4. The gymnasium was packed for the monthly open sparring session. Marines, Navy personnel, and various special operations troops filled the bleachers, creating a buzz of excitement. These sessions were legendary on base, a chance to test skills against operators from different units and learn new techniques. Sarah arrived early, her bruised throat still visible despite her attempt to cover it with a high-collar shirt under her training gear. She could feel eyes on her as she stretched on the side mat. The whispers were easy to imagine. Commander Walsh entered through the main doors, and the room's energy shifted. When a living legend walked in, people paid attention. He wore simple training gear, but his presence commanded respect. He scanned the room and gave Sarah a brief nod. Sergeant Webb was running the session. He stood at the center mat, clipboard in hand, looking less confident than usual with Walsh in attendance. "All right, listen up," Webb called out. "We've got a great turnout today. This is open sparring, which means everyone participates. No rank on the mat, only skill matters." He paused, clearly aware of the irony given how he'd treated Sarah all week. "We'll rotate partners every 10 minutes. Remember, this is about learning and building skills, not about ego." The first rounds began. Sarah was paired with a young Marine who treated her with cautious respect. They worked through some basic grappling, and she offered him tips on improving his defense. It was how training should be, mutual growth and learning. Meanwhile, Jackson Reed and Tyler Moss were on the next mat over, working with partners from their unit. Sarah noticed them glancing her way periodically, smirking. They thought they'd gotten away with it. In their minds, they'd put her in her place, and no one was going to do anything about it. After the third rotation, Commander Walsh stepped onto the center mat. "Sergeant Webb, mind if I jump in for a round?" he asked, his tone casual. "Of course, sir, it would be an honor." Webb looked around the room. "Who wants to spar with Commander Walsh?" Several hands went up immediately. The chance to train with a legend didn't come often. But Walsh shook his head. "Actually, I was hopping to work with Reed and Moss. Separately, of course. I saw them sparring the other day, and I think I could offer some pointers." The color drained from Reed's face. Moss tried to maintain his cocky expression, but Sarah could see the nervousness in his eyes. Yes, sir," Reed said, stepping onto the mat. "I'd be honored." The room grew quiet. Everyone sensed something was about to happen. Walsh and Reed squared off. "So, Reed," Walsh said conversationally, "I understand you're pretty confident in your grappling. Why don't you show me what you've got?" Reed nodded and moved in cautiously. He was smart enough to know he was outmatched, but too proud to back down completely. They clinched, and Reed tried to use his size advantage, just as he had with Sarah. It didn't work. Walsh moved with efficiency that came from decades of experience. Within seconds, he had Reed off balance. Within 10 seconds, Reed was face down on the mat with Walsh's knee on his back and an arm lock applied. "Tap if it hurts," Walsh said calmly. Reed tapped immediately. They reset and Reed tried a different approach. It didn't matter. Walsh put him down again, this time with a leg lock that had Reed tapping frantically. On the third round, Walsh changed his strategy. He let Reed get into a dominant position, the same kind of position Reed had used on Sarah. Reed, sensing an opportunity, went for a choke. Walsh let him apply it. Reed squeezed, trying to force the tap. And then, with a movement so smooth it looked effortless, Walsh escaped, reversed the position, and locked in a rear naked choke of his own. But he didn't just make Reed tap, he held it. Not dangerously long, but long enough for Reed to understand what it felt like. Long enough for Reed to tap frantically 3 times before Walsh released him. Reed rolled away, gasping and coughing. His face was bright red and his eyes were wide with shock. Walsh stood up calmly. "Interesting thing about chokes, Reed. When someone taps, you release immediately. That's the rule. That's how we keep training safe." His voice carried across the silent gymnasium. "What you did to Lieutenant Commander Mitchell yesterday wasn't training. It was assault, and it was cowardly." The room was absolutely silent now. Every eye was on Reed, who looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. "Moss, you're up," Walsh said. Tyler Moss stepped onto the mat, his earlier confidence completely gone. The match was almost identical. Walsh gave him multiple opportunities to tap, then showed him exactly what it felt like to be held in a submission past the tap. When Moss rolled off the mat, gasping and humiliated, Walsh addressed the entire room. "Let me be clear about something," he said, his voice carrying authority. "The strength of any unit comes from trust and respect. When you deliberately hurt a teammate, when you abuse your size advantage, when you target someone because of their gender or age or any other reason, you're not tough. You're weak. You're a liability." He looked directly at Sergeant Webb. And when leaders allow that behavior to continue, when they look the other way because it's easier than addressing the problem, they fail everyone in their command. Webb's face was ashen. He knew his career had just taken a serious hit. Walsh turned to Sarah. "Lieutenant Commander Mitchell, would you join me on the mat?" Sarah's heart pounded as she stepped forward. Walsh smiled at her, a genuine, warm smile. "Show them what a real Navy SEAL looks like," he said quietly. Part 5. Sarah stood across from Commander Walsh on the center mat, aware that every eye in the gymnasium was on them. Her bruised throat still ached, but the pain felt different now, like a badge of honor rather than a mark of shame. "Don't hold back," Walsh said quietly, loud enough only for her to hear. "Show them what 20 years of experience looks like." They touched gloves and began. Unlike his matches with Reed and Moss, Walsh didn't hold back with Sarah. This was a real sparring session between 2 operators who respected each other. They moved across the mat in a display of technique that had the watching crowd mesmerized. Sarah felt the rhythm of it, the give and take, the testing of defenses, the chess match of positioning. Walsh was better than her. His experience and natural talent were undeniable, but Sarah held her own, defending against his attacks and launching her own. At one point she nearly caught him in an armbar. The crowd gasped. Walsh escaped, but he grinned as he did. "Nice," he said. They continued for a full 5 minutes, much longer than the usual sparring rounds. When Walsh finally tapped her shoulder to signal the end, both were breathing hard. The gymnasium erupted in applause. Walsh raised Sarah's hand like a boxing referee declaring a winner. "This," he announced to the crowd, "is what a Navy SEAL looks like. This is what earned respect looks like. Anyone who thinks otherwise can come see me personally, and we'll have a conversation about it." The message was clear. Sarah Mitchell had a powerful ally now, and anyone who tried to intimidate or assault her would answer to Commander Walsh. As Sarah stepped off the mat, several people approached her. Handshakes, words of respect, apologies from those who had remained silent. The atmosphere had shifted completely. Reed and Moss sat in the corner, humiliated and isolated. Their friends had distanced themselves, not wanting to be associated with what had been exposed. Later that afternoon, Sarah was called to the base commander's office. She walked in expecting more trouble but found Commander Walsh already there, along with Colonel Jennifer Martinez, the base commander. "Sit down, Lieutenant Commander," Colonel Martinez said. She was a stern woman in her 50s, known for running a tight ship. "Commander Walsh has briefed me on the events of this week. I want to hear your account directly." Sarah told her everything: the dismissive treatment from Sergeant Webb, the deliberate choking from Reed and Moss, the hostile environment she'd been facing. As she spoke, she watched Colonel Martinez's expression grow darker. "Why didn't you report this immediately?" the colonel asked. Sarah chose her words carefully. "With respect, ma'am, I've seen how these reports can derail careers. I wasn't sure it would be taken seriously." Colonel Martinez was quiet for a moment. "That's a damning indictment of our system, Lieutenant Commander, and unfortunately it's probably accurate." She stood up and walked to the window. "But let me be clear, that ends now. On my base, assault is assault. Gender doesn't matter. Rank doesn't matter." She turned back to Sarah. "Effective immediately, Sergeant Webb is being removed from his instructor position pending a full investigation. Reed and Moss are being transferred to different units and will face disciplinary action. And I'm implementing new oversight protocols for all training programs." Sarah felt relief wash over her. "Thank you, ma'am." "Don't thank me. Thank Commander Walsh for having the backbone to bring this to my attention." Colonel Martinez sat back down. "Now I have a proposition for you. We need a new lead instructor for the Advanced Combat Program, someone with real operational experience, someone who understands that strength comes in many forms. Interested?" Sarah was stunned. "Ma'am, I'm honored, but—" "You're qualified, you're experienced, and most importantly, you understand what it means to maintain standards while treating people with respect." The colonel smiled slightly. "Besides, it's time we had more women in leadership positions. You'd be setting an example for the next generation." Sarah looked at Commander Walsh, who nodded encouragingly. "I accept, ma'am," Sarah said. 3 months later, Sarah stood in the same gymnasium, watching her students run through combat drills. The culture had changed dramatically. Respect was now the foundation of every training session. When someone tapped, partners released immediately. When someone struggled, others offered help instead of mockery. Reed and Moss were gone, transferred to different bases where they would have to rebuild their reputations from scratch. Sergeant Webb had been demoted and reassigned to administrative duties. The message had been clear: abuse would not be tolerated. Sarah had implemented new training protocols that emphasized technique over brute force, teamwork over individual ego. The program was producing better operators, and everyone knew it. One afternoon, a young female Marine approached Sarah after class. She was 19, fresh out of basic training, and looked nervous. "Ma'am, can I ask you something?" "Of course," Sarah said. "Some of the guys have been saying women don't belong in combat roles, that we're not strong enough." The young Marine looked down. "Is that true?" Sarah thought about everything she had been through: the deployments, the missions, the sacrifices. She thought about the men she'd served with who had respected her and the ones who hadn't. She thought about Reed and Moss and the lesson they'd learned. "Strength isn't just about how much you can lift or how hard you can hit," Sarah said. "Real strength is about perseverance. It's about getting back up when you're knocked down. It's about proving yourself over and over again without losing who you are." She put a hand on the young Marine's shoulder. "You belong here just as much as anyone else, and don't ever let anyone tell you different." The young Marine smiled, standing a little taller. "Yes, ma'am, thank you." As Sarah watched her walk away, she thought about the photograph on her desk. her old team, the ones who had accepted her from the start. They would be proud of what she'd built here. She'd turned a place of hostility into a place of growth. She'd transformed humiliation into leadership. That evening, Commander Walsh stopped by her office. "How's it going, Lead Instructor Mitchell?" Sarah smiled. "Better than I expected, sir. Thank you again for everything you did." "I didn't do anything except remind people of who you already were." Walsh leaned against the doorframe. "You know, that day in the gymnasium when I raised your hand, that wasn't about you winning a sparring match. It was about reminding everyone that respect isn't given based on gender or age. It's earned through dedication and sacrifice, and you'd earned it 1,000 times over." "Those boys learned their lesson, I hope," Sarah said. "They did, and more importantly, everyone else learned it too." Walsh smiled. "You're making a real difference here, Sarah. The next generation of SEALs is going to be better because of you." After he left, Sarah sat alone in her office, looking at the new photograph on her desk. It showed her current class, men and women of all ages and backgrounds standing together as a team. They weren't perfect, but they were learning. They were growing. And they were building something better. Sarah touched the bruises on her throat. They had faded to yellow now, almost gone. But she would never forget what they represented, the moment she had to choose between staying silent and standing up. The moment someone had finally stood up with her. She thought about all the women who would come after her, who would face their own challenges and doubts. She hoped her story would give them courage. She hoped they would remember that strength came in many forms, and that justice sometimes required patience, allies, and the courage to keep fighting even when the system seemed stacked against you.